For millennia, cities have been places where bright ideas spark. From the earliest riverside trading posts that turned into today's sprawling megacities in the digital global economy. Cities can create positive experiences for people, always connected by technology. And when connected places work well, it's good for people and the planet. But making a connected place succeed is hard. There's loads of stakeholders, businesses, regulators, and community groups who want to be involved across every mode of transport, every type of building, the infrastructure that underpins them, and the data and digital platforms that connect them. All of this is needed to help people, communities, neighbourhoods, and local businesses to prosper. Now, more than ever, we need our connected places to succeed. We are in a climate emergency. Rapid urbanisation means 3/4 of us will be living in a city by 2050. And new technologies are revolutionising the way we live, the way we work, and the way we travel, creating fantastic opportunities for innovation, jobs, and growth. At Connected Places Catapult, we connect people, places, and businesses for a future of sustainable growth and prosperity. We are the UK's innovation accelerator for cities, transport, and place leadership. We are trusted across government, industry, and academia. We bring cities together from across the world to connect new technologies, business models, and investment opportunities. So join with us and be better connected for a future of sustainable growth and prosperity.
Hello and welcome to today's Enlightening Fireside Chat webinar, where we have the privilege of delving into the expertise and insights of a true trailblazer in the realm of digital transformation and infrastructure with a strong focus on procurement. But before I introduce our guest speaker, Chris, I'd like to introduce myself. So I'm Rikesh Shah. I'm the head of the Innovation Procurement Empowerment Center at the Connected Places Catapult. So what is IPEC? The Innovation Procurement Empowerment Center. It's about creating best value. It's about creating best value from the market and bringing innovation in. So whether it's doing things cheaper, whether it's doing things better, whether it's doing things quicker, fairer, or even greener. UK PLC, or the public sector in the UK, spends around £300 billion a year, and 70 billion of that pound is spent through local authorities. But what we're seeing is the diversification of the supply chain. We're seeing innovators from startups, from scale-ups, from academia, as well as innovators from the corporate world. And it's just, how do we bring them in to solve some of the challenges that we have in the public sector to create that best value? So through IPEC, what we're looking to do is to build some advocacy and create some thought leadership around how innovation through procurement can add value. We're also working with academic institutes to build evidence and use that evidence to shape policy. So we're working very closely with the University of Birmingham and the University of Manchester. But also practically, IPEC is helping to create new tools and skills development. So our colleagues, whether they're in a local authority or at national government level, are able to get the best out of innovating through procurement. So that could be the whole end-to-end process, from defining problems, to running trials, to scouting the market, to developing business cases at the end of the trial, to ultimately changing and scaling and through awarding contracts to the diverse supply chain, creating best value. And then finally, it's also about building a community. So working closely with local authorities and others. So how do we create best practice and share best practice and make sure that other people are able to, through the coalition of the willing, able to create value through innovating through procurement. So going back to today's session, I'm really excited to welcome Chris. And in the next 90 minutes, we'll look at how local authorities are focusing on innovating through procurement, particularly around driving digital change, which has been a game changer in the fiber optic connectivity world, where over 1,500 public service sites across the UK have deployed this innovative route, making it the largest local full fiber network program in the UK. So before we dive in and bring Chris into this, he has over 3 decades of experience in the public and private sector. Chris has been at the forefront of progressive local authority projects. His leadership, he's the managing director at CJ Founds Associates, has left an indelible mark, delivering strategies, securing funding, and driving positive change through transformative digital connectivity and infrastructure programs. Chris, I'm really excited, will share some of his insights around the innovative procurement processes that he's applied through his career, particularly in a highly regulated industry that has not only shaped areas such as Greater Manchester, but other local authorities across the UK, where he secured millions of funding from central government. So really excited to welcome you here today, Chris. And finally, if anyone has any questions for Chris, please put them in the question and answers section, and we'll get to them during or towards the end of the session. But Chris, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you today. And perhaps as a kickoff, could you talk a little bit about digital connectivity? What is it and why is it important?
Yeah, good morning, Rikesh. And firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. We've got lots and lots to kind of share, and some really, really great best practice that, we've been very fortunate to be involved with across a lot of local authority and places. And obviously places is really, really important as part of this. So yeah, really, really kind of looking forward to kind of sharing some of that knowledge. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting kind of question really to start with. We know that digital shapes lives. We know that digital shapes places. And we also know that we're in a world of, massive reliance on digital. And that comes with, real exciting opportunities, but also it comes with some real challenges. And of course, we have to make sure that we're creating connected but also inclusive societies, where people have access to all the right technology, and if we're moving services to digitally based platforms, we've got to make sure that reaches out to the whole of all of our communities. So very interesting, because I think I really like the intro video, which kind of set the scene very, very well around what digital infrastructure does, and that's where we kind of specialize in terms of the work we do with a lot of our clients, and all of our clients are kind of public sector focused, whether or not that's combined authorities or local authorities or even district councils, and there's some fantastic models that authorities have kind of done out there. And you touched on the local full fibre network with Greater Manchester, and the whole piece around, actually how can you bring 10 local authorities together and connect 1,600 public sector sites? And, I think we have to kind of almost go right the way back to policy making and our ambition as a country to very much push forward and bring ourselves more comparable with some of our European and world partner cities and organisations, and Greater Manchester's ambition, kind of going right the way back now to when the local full fibre network funding was first put together, and at the time kind of BD UK were putting out opportunities for cities and regions to bid for this funding. So a real kind of big ambitious approach was adopted by Greater Manchester, in that we kind of looked at it. We worked with all of our 10 authority partners and Transport for Greater Manchester, as well as the passenger transport exec, to kind of look at what the art of the possible was, and how we could take forward the programme. And actually, how would we fund something? Because we knew we wouldn't be able to get something of that scale completely funded through the LFFM programme. So there was some quite early innovative kind of thinking, and some real joined up collaboration across the authorities to try and look at, actually, we're all paying for our own connectivity contracts. If we did it at scale and looked at capitalising that forward revenue cost, and actually creating something that allowed us to do a lot more joined up public sector service provision, then we could potentially look to part fund it. So anyway, we were able to put together a program of nearly £30 million, which was very much focused at connecting a lot of public sector sites, and that was just the bid and kind of getting us to the starting line in terms of the way that particular program was put together.
Thank you, Chris. And perhaps, like, if we think about the gigabyte broadband with incredible speeds, or we think about 5G deployment, and these are key priorities both at a central government level but also at a local government level, and it feels connectivity, and rightfully so, is a utility that everyone should have access to. But what we saw is the gigabyte availability is around 75% nationally, and it's around 5G is around, coverage wise, is about 76%. What's your view? How are we doing, and what more is there to be done, and how can innovation help?
Yeah, it's really interesting that you look at those statistics, because when you bring it right the way back into a regional perspective, and I'm sure there'll be colleagues on this webinar that will kind of say, I'd love to get somewhere up near kind of 75% connectivity, because I just simply haven't got it. So there's published statistics, there are reality on the ground, and there's a whole load of other different measures in between. And I think what I find really interesting with that, of course, is that not everybody needs gigabit connectivity, and there are some people who don't even reach super fast connectivity. So if you recall, there was a big program that kind of we instigated probably from about 2010 onwards, to try and at least get everyone up to 30 megabits, which kind of sounds crazy at the time. And now we're talking about gigabit capable connectivity. And of course, not everybody needs that. And some people are more reliant on, as you rightly say, Rakesh, the 5G side, some people are more reliant on mobile connectivity. And if you've got, things like the shared rural network that's being, kind of put together and successfully rolled out across Scotland and other areas, that kind of really, that gives us a number of different platforms, a number of different technologies that rural communities can rely on. I think I only saw something recently on another batch of Starlink satellites that have been kind of sent out, and I kind of thought to myself at the time, that's really, really interesting, because of course there's a whole load of satellite technologies that are now kind of starting to come into play in terms of how they would operate. So I think in terms of the importance of infrastructure and connectivity, it has different meanings and different manifestations for different end users, and you always have to kind of remember what is that, who are the end beneficiaries? Is it societal thing? Is it a local community? Is it actually that we are trying to create a smart place where we've got huge significance and reliance on actually having kind of that connectivity that means that we can go into any environment, whether it's the high street, we can go into community centres, we can go into shops, libraries, and everyone's reliant on it. I think pretty much now everybody has a mobile phone, and that brings challenges around data. Some people are able to afford data and others aren't. And I know certainly on the likes of the Greater Manchester programme, where we were able to look at bringing some value into that, was adding some requirements as part of the procurement, where we wanted the suppliers to connect those 1,600 public sector buildings, but we also wanted that additionality. So what more can we do? How can we support our residents and communities? And we were very, very fortunate to be a business who were the partner to deliver that. And just a couple of little tiny things to note on that was that we were able to develop a tech fund. So the tech fund actually funded and created the ability to provide equipment and devices out to our wider communities and people who just simply couldn't get online because they didn't have the capacity or capability in terms of the technology. We also funded a digital inclusion officer, so somebody who would work with all of the local authorities across Greater Manchester, and the individual community groups. And that's just a small little example of where actually you've got to kind of understand the environment to be able to actually know and kind of understand what connectivity requirements there are. You know, a lot of people talk about next gen wireless and 5G, and 5G will be fantastic when it is all up and running and enabled, but it's got greater scope at the moment in the private network space. So advanced manufacturing and, you know, industrial and commerce areas, you know, to really kind of drive economic advantage and industry forward. I think from a public sector perspective, we're just grappling with what 5G can bring. And yet we've got a lot of, you know, devices and technology and equipment that could be connected to that, smart signals, for instance, or air quality sensors and air quality monitoring. And again, you know, the ability to then connect things like local energy management networks and local energy grids, so that you really kind of you're creating and looking at that infrastructure more holistically, right the way across a number of different policy and program areas. I think, you know, projects like Project Gigabit that BD UK and you know are kind of putting out at the moment is really important, because that continues to show our investment at a UK PLC level to try and make sure that we are, you know, identifying them areas, that last kind of 15-20%, as we call it, that still don't have good connectivity. So I think yeah, there's a huge amount for us to do, and I think, you know, there are, you know, part of this is those kind of local groups, and I know some you know, certainly a lot of local authorities, and there'll be colleagues on this on the webinar who, you know, have got digital champions in their localities and have supported local community groups to upskill and train digital champions to better understand connectivity needs. And I think once we have that right the way across, you know, all of our local authority areas, whether it's our city areas, whether it's our rural areas, whether it's, you know, some of our, you know, smaller towns and villages, you know, once we've kind of got a go-to point and for people to understand need better, then we're in a much better place to be able to, you know, define what that connectivity requirements are. And, you know, we've got, you know, 75-76% on the statistics, you know, sound great. We've got a lot to do yet. You know, that is very polarized and focused in particular areas. And, you know, there's a whole lot of stuff that we've got to look at. And, you know, don't even get me started yet on what the industry needs to bring to that, because I think, you know, that's another kind of complete topic as well. Like,
yeah, brilliant. And my colleague James is putting some links on the chat, so please, I encourage everyone to have a look. And building on what you've just said there, Chris, let's look at it from two lenses. Let's look at it from a local authority lens, but also let's look at it from an end user lens. And in my previous life, I used to get approached by a lot of the infrastructure players, including telcos, to say your answer to everything is 5G. You know, you need to invest in 5G infrastructure. How would you, if there's a local authority here on the call, how would you encourage them to think about use cases, both as a local authority provider, i.e. getting the infrastructure right, but also serving their citizens? What would you suggest they should be doing?
yeah, it's a really, really good question, that, Rakesh. And there's probably not a single, you know, kind of answer that encapsulates all of that. I think it's a whole host of different interventions. And what I'm massively encouraged about with what we see across a lot of our local authority clients is that they're approaching it, they're starting to recognize that and approach it that way. So there's an infrastructure element, there's an inclusion element, there's a skills and a training element as part of that. And I think part of the biggest challenge really is to try and make sure that, you know, across a number of different program areas, there is a growing and built awareness of what digital can bring. And I think from that develops the use cases. And I give a good example of that. You know, if you're talking about doing a local energy management scheme where maybe you might be kind of putting air source heat pumps into social housing, for instance. Well, if you can connect those air source heat pumps so they all become, you know, a kind of a smart asset, then actually you start growing a real potential there that benefits the community, it benefits the local energy providers, and it also means you start managing demand much better. So if organizations come together, and I think part of the challenge is that quite often, you know, use cases need a number of different collaborators to make them work. And I think that's an important role that certainly local authorities, have got to play. And colleagues I've worked with, and I'll use examples up in North Tyneside, and kind of some of the work that they're doing up there, is really, really quite powerful, because actually they're just convening, they are bringing partner organizations together to actually make organizations kind of start joining up in terms of their thinking. Funding quite often has it's a barrier, in that, if you're looking at kind of bringing forward revenue to put some capital asset in the ground or up on poles, or you're creating a wireless network, for instance, that's quite difficult at times, because of course you've then got to create the investment case. And I always kind of look at it that stacked use cases are where we're moving towards. So actually you need to not just come up with a single use case, you actually need to put a number of different use cases together. And I kind of use the placemaking piece in terms of smart transport, and then kind of smart transport leads to smart air quality, and smart air quality leads to smart energy management, and it goes on. And I think that's often the challenge, is that quite often we end up almost siloed in directorates within local authorities, where there isn't that strategic thought leadership. And certainly some of the authorities we're working with, the Berkshire authorities, the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, Liverpool City Region Combined Authority, to have that senior sponsorship, whether it's at chief exec level, whether it's at kind of member or mayoral level, is really, really important to drive agendas. And I think by having good leadership and people who are committed to want to do the right thing in terms of digital, whether that's from the digital inclusion or digital infrastructure perspective, is really, really important. And of course, what that does, that filters right the way through the whole process in terms of, right, okay, what is it? What's our demand? What's our need? Let's identify the problems and the challenges. Let's make sure that we can then identify use cases to be built up from that, which generate the commercial ambition and the relevant funding to be levied to do that. And of course, you can then start structuring procurement approaches that allow you to deliver those ambitions, and almost kind of keep your procurement really, really focused and aligned to the objectives and the aims and ambitions that you set out with in the first place. So I think it's it's really important in terms of the way that the use cases stack up, because it's really use cases that drive the ability for authorities to do some really innovative things. And quite often, at the moment, I think there's a lot of authorities still grappling with that. We grapple with it, in authorities bringing us in and sort of saying, can you do something here? And quite often you've got to be able to articulate what the art of the possible is, and work with senior leaders, and really do a massive piece in terms of that stakeholder engagement and management, to try and even get to the point where, yes, there is a use case here that we can do. And clearly funded programs coming from DSIT and others are really helpful, because that kind of creates a little bit of a catalyst to aim for.
And thank you, Chris. And from what you're saying, and just to clarify, so when it comes to digital infrastructure programs, I think what you're suggesting is, let's have a system-wide approach, and then bring use cases in, rather than having lots of separate use cases that have their own digital infrastructure strategy, where you end up doing things 30, 40, 50 times in a local authority. Is that, and if that's the case, who do you think is responsible? We'll have heads of procurement on this call, we'll have service owners. Who's responsible for developing that digital infrastructure strategy? Because if I'm thinking locally, I'll be just thinking about my problem statements, not everyone else is in the business.
Yeah, I think a challenge that a lot of authorities have is that the resource just simply isn't there, like it was maybe 20 or so years ago. There's a lot of pressure on local authorities to deliver a lot more for less and with less expertise. And I think part of the challenge there is really how do you create those digital, I'm going to call them digital ambassadors, within authorities, not necessarily digital champions. How do you create those roles that allow a wider conversation to take place across multiple policy areas, and then And then, you know, the smarter authorities, the authorities that are definitely more progressive, have got that senior understanding, you know, from chief exec and member level down, and would probably have somebody like a digital infrastructure portfolio holder, or, you know, somebody from a member perspective who takes, you know, a real passion and an interest, not just in digital skills. I think we've all got, you know, most authorities have now got somebody, you know, dealing with digital skills, and quite a lot of authorities have got inclusion, you know, digital inclusion kind of roles now, which again is really, really important. But of course, that cross cuts against a number of different areas, whether it's housing, whether it's social adult care, you know, whether it's working back with NHS and CCGs. And I think, you know, it's important that, you know, there is at least a go-to person in authorities, because what that does, that opens up the conversation with suppliers, whether you're putting in, you know, you're an infrastructure provider who wants to put small cells in, for instance, you know, and doesn't know how you unlock the planning system, and you know, you don't need to, because we can have small cell open access agreements, and some of it is really developing the knowledge and understanding back in the authorities, and the authorities having the confidence and the drive to actually say, do you know, it's such an important enabler piece. It doesn't have to, you know, we don't have to boil the ocean with this. We don't have to have somebody who does everything for digital ever. And equally, we've kind of seen a move from digital not just being within the IT teams and the digital teams, but actually becoming part of the placemaking conversation, and generally sitting with place directors, and also economic development teams, you know, and we've done some recent work with the Berkshire authorities, and I'd encourage people to have a look at the digital infrastructure group and the digital adoption strategy, which is a UK first, really, in trying to kind of bring together highways planning, economic development, and digital teams to develop, against policy and program areas, shared ambitions and shared use cases in terms of being able to take digital forward, because it's only really kind of joining them all up, you know, will we get there, and you know, authorities that have kind of been progressive in doing that, and Liverpool City Region Combined Authority, you know, they've got a senior officer working group which brings together 6 different local authorities, and I know other places have, Greater London and West Midlands, you know, there's a lot of really, really good examples of that. I'd certainly actively encourage, you know, local authorities to start opening up and widening out a lot of the conversation, because the more you can do things at scale at a regional level, suppliers generally will respond to that a lot more, because yeah, it's difficult for suppliers to go and put a footprint or a foothold in a small town or a village, and that might be exactly where the need is. But actually, if that can be done across maybe a geographic area, then quite often, you know, you can open up them conversations. And I think what it also does, it gives a kind of a bit of a focal point. If authorities have got, you know, a go-to person, a digital ambassador, you know, it's a go-to point in terms of somebody who can, you know, very much support industry in coming and bringing some of this real innovation that we know they've got. You know, whether that's done formally through procurement, or whether it's done through, you know, kind of just, you know, informal conversations around investment need, you know, it kind of needs to have a bit of a focus, really.
And I do want to ask you about your 5G innovation pilots in a second, but building on what you've just said, is technology is changing at such a fast rate. And as a result, if we invest heavily in digital infrastructure now, we might be out of date by the time we procured it. So how would you advise local authorities in particular to be nimble when it comes to their procurement approach, so they're constantly future-proofing as best as they can?
It's a really interesting dynamic, this, isn't it? Because you wind the clock back, and if we look at past performance, you know, we didn't think we'd probably be where we were now without something like, you know, a pandemic to, you know, accelerate our reliance on digital. And, you know, whilst that has had a lot of real negatives, you know, it's also given people a lot more forward visibility and foresight in terms of what they need to be thinking about. I think, you know, the biggest thing that probably we have to recognize is that there's still a huge role for, you know, managing our data. So, you know, data warehousing, edge computing we talk about quite a bit. You know, how do we make sure that we're not backhauling lots and lots of data back into our big centers or our huge big data centers, you know, in the middle of, you know, wherever Shire. And what we've got to kind of start thinking about is more of that local piece. So if that's a local infrastructure network, or actually it's a, you know, a dark fiber network, for instance, that gives you ultimate potential, because we know fiber really carries both our mobile network and it also carries our fixed ambitions in terms of, you know, kind of real high resilient, high capacity connectivity. So, you know, fiber is going to be there, absolutely. The architecture around that, you know, that's not my specialist subject, and yet, you know, we're seeing more and more of actual local authorities wanting to put dark fiber networks in, because they know what that will stimulate is an ecosystem of smaller organizations to be able to use that. And what's interesting from that then is that if you make that open access and ubiquitous as well, actually what you're doing, you are creating more competition in areas, and you're being able to open that up for public sector use. And that's exactly what Greater Manchester did with theirs. And you know, Mid Sussex District Council put in a local full fibre network that was somewhere around about 25 kilometres to connect up Burgess Hill. And what that did, that stimulated a cooperative contract mechanism and a cooperative model, which meant that anyone could join the cooperative and become a member of the cooperative. So it's cooperative network infrastructure who actually operate and maintain that network, but it's open access. So it means that any startup organizations, any SMEs can come forward and do that. And that was right at the cutting edge, really, of when the LFFM programs came out. You know, we had the 1600 anchor tenancy up in Greater Manchester, and then we had the cooperative model down in Mid Sussex, and of course that was all based on fibre, and it was all based on having fibre infrastructure, dark fibre infrastructure, that gave you the ability to then do all of the fancy things on top of it. Whether you wanted to put a, you know, an edge computing facility, a data centre, you know, as part of a library, for instance. And you know, we're doing some work at the moment with a client up in the northwest who are looking to do exactly that, to put a lot of their library service online and set up a kind of what I'm going to call an edge computing, edge data center right in the middle of the town, to actually allow the library service to have everything in terms of what they, all of their records and archives and everything. But of course, that needs high-end processing to allow you to go in and access that on big smart screens and things like that. So, and of course, around that, we would then expect to see a growth of tech industries. And of course, that drives some of the economic activities for particular areas. So I think for me, Rakesh, it's about fiber. It's about thinking about where wireless is taking us and making sure that wireless, there's lots of different wireless technologies, as you know. We probably haven't maxed out 4G yet, and you know, we're already on to 5G and what 5G can bring. You know, there's a whole piece there around making sure that ultimately, you know, we're at the stage where wireless is as open access as fiber can be as well. And then, of course, it's how you process things. So people talk about low latency. You know, we want to bring it right the way down so it processes things immediately, and we haven't got lags and things. And you know, that's where we're seeing a lot of advanced manufacturing starting to rely on some of that technology. So for me, it's a number of different things that create that kind of infrastructure, really.
And that's fascinating, because you're saying let's get the infrastructure right at a local region, but then beyond that, in terms of innovation, if you're creating open access, you can let the market, the ecosystem that you create, solve your problems in a much more creative way. So you're not just stuck with one supplier to come up with the solutions. Is that, and so how do you design that from a procurement point of view? Because, you know, if I play this through, you've got a contract with one fiber provider, then you've got to sort of leave it open so you can bring other people into the ecosystem to get access. How is it complicated?
So yeah, I mean, there's this thing called subsidy control,
yeah.
and it, you know, kind of old state aid money for those that remember it, pre-Brexit. So clearly, subsidy control gives us that framework that we need to work within, and there are a number of different models that authorities can look at. And I think, for me, having kind of run quite a few of these different procurements and different models, what's important is that you really need to kind of go back to basics and do that options appraisal and really test what is it that we're looking for as an authority area. What problems are we trying to solve? What sort of period of time are we looking at this to be over, and what sort of investments are we putting in? And equally, what sort of market appetite is there for these types of projects and requirements that we may have? And yes, we could expand our existing, wide area networks. They're very traditional type contracts. But also what we're seeing now is a layered type approach. So, it might be that actually we look to partner with somebody and develop a kind of an approach in terms of the infrastructure requirements at a particular layer, at a particular level. And then we might do something different with a different group of people to maybe bring in the integrators and the interconnects. And then we might do something different again in terms of the wireless side of it. So what we're really looking at is kind of not, it's back to what we talked about earlier. It's the use cases, and it's not dismissing anything too early on, giving yourself ultimately the flexibility through your procurement in terms of going through the subsidy control checks, making sure there's an element of, certainly for the public sector, an element of anchor tenancy, so that we're not distorting the market, and we're not gonna get disgruntled suppliers kind of coming back and saying, hang on a minute, the public sector are working in a market that we should be in, but actually actively engaging the market around what those requirements are. And I think we've certainly seen a lot more dark fiber networks going in that then provide that open accessibility. And the cooperative model is a great example of where, that is on a mutual basis. It's not for profit, so it's for the operating costs of the members. And that ticks a lot of boxes in terms of the subsidy control checks that you need to do. The other option, of course, is just straight anchor tenancy, so single supplier, public sector connectivity requirement. And then obviously off the back of that, the supplier is able to deliver some additionality. And I kind of mentioned before around some of the extra bits you can build in as part of your evaluation criteria into your procurements around, what social value requirements are. Most authorities now have a 10 to 15%, possibly even pushing 20%. Some authorities are looking at social value weighting as part of procurement. Yep. And, that's really quite powerful to put into a digital infrastructure project, because what you really do then, you start stimulating that innovation, the art of the possible, the what ifs, the tech funds, the digital inclusion roles, the training and skills piece. There's a lot that you can kind of build into that. And I think it's really important that there's a number of different frameworks out there, Crown Commercial Service frameworks and things like NetServe 3 now, I think we're up to, that give authorities the ability to tap into. But what I would say is that, authorities can be bold themselves. They don't have to necessarily use national frameworks. I think there's a lot still to be done in terms of the digital space. It's perhaps not as mature as things like, highways contracts and energy contracts, which are, there's a lot of template documents and template contracts out there that allow and navigate and lead local authorities through that process. And, there is a lot of good practice. And I think one of the things, we're certainly encouraging is a lot more shared learning across local authorities. The combined authorities do it well, and there's clusters of combined authorities, including West Mids and Glasgow and GLA and Greater Manchester, who do talk on a regular basis. Probably doesn't happen enough with some of the other authorities, and I think it's getting better, definitely getting better. And I think some of that shared conversation about, kind of practices and what people have experienced and how procurements have been put together, and what contract document did you use, and how did you get your commercial model right, and how did you get over subsidy control challenges, You know, all of that is out there. You know, there's a lot of really, really good examples, and you know, authorities are only too willing to share. And you know, I think there's a really, you know, there's a big role to play there. And again, we talked about resources earlier. If you haven't got the resources in the authority, the champions, it's difficult for somebody to spend time, you know, kind of doing some of that. And I suppose, you know, that in part, that's where we, you know, we come in as a small organization, you know, to try and be a little bit of a catalyst, a glue, you know, linking up, you know, different best practice and different models.
Thank you. And perhaps, yeah, that's a good time to also promote that, you know, within IPEC, we do have a LinkedIn group where people can share best practice. So the call out from Chris is a good one, that if you are a local authority or even a national authority, please do share some of your case studies around digital infrastructure, procurements in particular, and how you've been driving innovation. Chris, just going back to the point on framework, you know, is it too fixed, not flexible and inflexible? Or so do you think local authorities should design their own ones to drive their own flexibility, or do you think there is a case for both?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, that one, Rakesh. I mean, there's certainly, you know, there's a lot of value in having, you know, nationally procured frameworks, you know, and Crown Commercial Service frameworks and things like that. I think what we do see, though, is that quite often the requirements are slightly different for different authorities, and therefore you end up changing the framework contract documents more than you actually do in terms of creating your own.
Yeah.
I think, you know, kind of, you know, looking at, you know, going right the way back to ambition, objectives, use cases, you know, what is it we're trying to achieve? What's the best way of doing it? Quite often, you know, we're putting infrastructure in the ground, and there are a lot of, you know, really, really good models and contract forms that you can go and pick off the shelf. NEC contracts, you know, with the Mid Sussex project, you know, we actually used the SCAPE framework, which was a national civil engineering framework, to put the fibre and the ducting in the ground. That was the first time it had been used, you know, in that way, you know, because traditionally it had been used for building schools or roads or bridges or, you know, hospitals. So I think, you know, there's a whole host of different ways that authorities can approach it, and clearly, you know, there are some template documents out there. But what I would say is that, you know, pick the phone up, have the conversation, you know, share some of the learning, look at authorities that have been quite progressive, ask them what they've done, you know, ask them to engage with their legal teams, you know, and look at the forms of contracts. Contracts are not difficult, you know, you know, they have the aura around them that we've got to get it right because
Yep.
of risk and liability. Actually co-design it a little bit with industry, you know, co-design specifications in terms of that, and work with industry, because you want industry to respond to procurements. You know, the last thing you want is a, you know, a kind of a, you know, a single supplier rocking up and sort of saying, actually, yeah, I'm quite happy and I'm interested in this. You want competition, you know, and competition brings innovation. And I think that's quite important, that, you know, you don't necessarily have to default back to what you've always done, or to, you know, existing frameworks. You know, be bold enough to, you know, to put your own together. You know, local authorities got some really fantastic practitioners. It's just identifying them and giving them the ability to, you know, have their voice and you know, have a go at doing these things.
And in terms of, you know, going back to sort of test beds and the 5G test bed that you've been involved with, you know, there's a risk here that we don't maximize value from 4G and we move straight to 5G. And then there's a risk that people are already thinking about 6G and perhaps even 7G. And irrespective of what spectrum you go with, it's a big investment for a local authority or even a national authority. How would you suggest we best use test beds to make sure that we can create a business case in the long run?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen quite a lot of funding coming out more recently to do exactly that. So the HDD project, or the One project from DCIT, and then more recently the 5G innovation regions, you know, which has a whole host of different types of projects, all with different use cases, you know, whether we're talking about tourism or leisure or agri-tech or energy networks, you know, or just smart places generally. And I think, you know, there's a whole host of different interfaces, different technologies to test, and to look at this whole challenge between public and private networks. And I know certainly some of the ones that we're involved in on the 5GIR program, on these latest test beds and pilots, you know, will be absolutely looking to prove, can you join up? Can you get people on a single common platform? We know there's quite a lot of activity through the industry around the common wholesale and switching platforms to be able to switch between providers, and that equally will ultimately find its way through to mobile network providers. I think we're probably closer to seeing it achieved for fixed providers. But what, of course, that these test beds bring the ability to challenge some of that. And I think what I'm massively encouraged about with some of the stuff that DSIT are doing is that one of the big elements of a lot of the pilots is that shared learning.
Yeah.
It's very much bringing that learning back. What works, what doesn't work. We were very fortunate to be part of the DCIA, the Digital Connectivity Infrastructure Accelerator down in Berkshire. And we put the bid together, and we managed the program, and we worked with the team down there, and some fantastic individuals down there who were really keen to kind of prove it. And that was all about, right, can we introduce lots of small cells to actually, enable us so that they're all 5G enabled? And your point earlier, Rakesh, about 4G and what more can we do? And actually, there's a whole load of wireless technologies that don't even rely on 4G that actually we probably haven't maxed out. And I think partly is because inevitably we chase the funding a little bit, and also probably it's about those use cases that we talked about earlier. What is it that we're trying to solve? What's the issues? Do we want town center Wi-Fi? Is that actually a really big enabler for us and a key driver? Or actually is it enabling our economies and our advanced manufacturing and our business parks, and actually giving them really high-end connectivity capacity? But of course, if you're not geared up for it because you haven't got the kit or you haven't got the technology to access 5G, then is that the best technology at the moment? Possibly not. In terms of that, I think we absolutely need to be heading in that direction, because we know how you mentioned earlier how technology is moving at pace, and we absolutely know that we've got a lot more. We are a society of connected devices at the moment, or we are. That is how we operate. And I think I did a test myself back in my own office, and I think we had 64 different devices connected at one point, just on a wireless network. So when you start thinking about how that will enable us going forward, I think there's still a lot to be sweated out of, existing 4G, and the market's got a big role to play there, and not just to kind of keep jumping forward. I think, we've seen, and we are going to continue to see consolidation in the market, and certainly the mobile market at the moment is a little bit fractious, and we're waiting to see what happens with some of these big mergers that have been announced. But also, there's a lot of organizations, diving in now to put things like small cells up and, next generation wireless. And we've just got to do it in a structured, coordinated way. And, authorities have got a big role to play there in terms of structuring either their own procurements or their own requirements, or just engaging with the market so that we can understand their investment requirements, because quite often their investment requirements are all driven around demand and end customer demand. And it's how we can make sure the two run in parallel, because we want better places, we want people to be enabled and have the right technology, but we also don't, we can't miss the digital inclusion bit, and those people in our society who maybe just don't have the ability to go and get data bundles, let alone connectivity, or to own a mobile phone that's a smart device. So it's about a lot of different interventions, I believe. That's where I think we're heading.
Thank you, and a shout out to others. If you've got any questions here for Chris, I'm finding this really interesting, and I'll keep on asking questions, but please do put them in the portal. So yeah, any questions for Chris? And Chris, when I worked in local authority in London, I used to sit on the Smart London board, and we're trying to define what does a smart city for London actually mean, and now perhaps we've moved a bit forward to say, what does a connected place mean? Because things are much more connected. I guess the question here is that how do we? There seems to be lots of barriers when it comes to scaling digital infrastructure. And that's just my personal reflection, whether it's organizational, whether it's from the market, or whether it's defining the right problems. What do you think some of the big barriers are? And there could be others, but how do we get around them? How do we overcome some of these barriers that we have? Because are we getting best value from digital infrastructure?
gosh, how long have we got, Rakesh? I think, for me, probably starting at the top, leadership, leadership is really, really important. And that's leadership in terms of disseminating ambition and purpose and, setting some really, really tangible goals and targets so that, you can align your organization around that. And then it comes to, for me, it's about, we authorities do some fantastic work in upskilling our societies and, reaching out to people and setting off, on all sorts of different training requirements and, putting a real digital theme around that, boot camps and, kind of, digital champions and inclusion networks. I think ultimately and equally, that also needs to happen internally.
Yeah.
So, one of the big barriers is really awareness of because it's such a fast moving industry at the moment, it's what, people need to be thinking about and incorporating that into policy and program areas.
Yeah.
And, I used the example earlier of, things like social housing and social adult care. There's been some fantastic pilots around social adult care, around telehealth and assisted living and things like that. But yeah, it's not commonplace in terms of the conversations. And yet it could have, real transformatory kind of benefits if we were to do more joining up. And I'm not saying that people aren't doing it, because there are some good pockets, but it's not a common conversation. The same in housing and with assets. Digital is almost kind of seen as, oh, we need that now, can we go and get it, rather than actually it being part of the conversation right from the beginning. And I think partly, that's because it's about affording time within authorities, because everyone's busy doing their day job and we don't have that massive resource. But actually, very quickly, just by embedding and putting experts and specialists in there, you can soon really, really upskill and, kind of get people more aware. And we've done some work recently with Liverpool City Region Combined Authority where, we brought together a lot of their program leads and policy leads just to talk about digital infrastructure and what digital can do and what their challenges are. And it was amazing to see the whole range of, from some people saying, oh yeah, we do digital all the time, to other people saying, oh my goodness, this is the first time I've seen it. But actually, if you applied the test to that, generally the people who are saying we do digital all the time were not doing it. And those people who were kind of saying, actually, we don't, we really like this, we're actually doing some good things with it already, but just didn't have the confidence or ability to move some of that forward. So I think there's a real role there. Then you bring in the regulatory layers. So, we talk about, a lot of this goes into the place. So that's planning, it's highways, it's economic development teams. And certainly some of the work we did with the Berkshire authorities, to push forward the digital adoption strategy, there's a huge piece to go and convene and bring all of the heads of those services together to talk about what can be done. And simple, there's some real simple levers that can be pulled, things like dig once policies, so that we're not all going in and, kind of digging the road up at different times. And there's a lot more coordination through things like the Traffic Management Act and the Streetworks, New Roads and Streetworks side. So from a highways point of view, and then of course the DCIA pilot, tested things like, how can we get small cells? And, no one wants huge, big masts. There is a role for masts, of course, but, we don't want them in our high street and in our localities. But actually, if you've got a butty box size bit of kit at the top of a street lighting column, which is 5G enabled, you're much less likely to kind of be concerned about it. So from a highways and, that comes right the way down to street lighting managers. And then from a planning point of view, we just talked about big masts, that's a real, there's a lot of barriers and myths to be busted, in terms of 5G and that side of it. But actually, there's an engagement piece, because quite often we've seen more too often, the market just coming in and saying, right, we want a mast here without any pre-engagement with the local authorities. And of course, then officers in authorities get it in the net from their local communities, residents and members, because there hasn't been that engagement side. So I think for me, another barrier that absolutely is in our gift to overcome is to set up regular market engagement, market advisory groups where you're working with the market on a regular basis. And certainly, we've been very successful up in Greater Manchester, Liverpool City region, Berkshire, and Sussex and other places where we've got some of them now established, and they are really paying dividends because it allows you to understand what the market's challenges are. And then when your procurements come up and you need to build in requirements, you've already done that pre-market engagement piece, like, in a subtle type of way, really. So I think regulatory aspects are quite important.
So just coming back on that, Chris, because I think that's a really important point, and it's something you touched on earlier, is horizon scanning, being that intelligent client of what's out there and what the art of the possible is. Do we do it enough in the local authority sector or even in just the public sector, or do we sometimes fall for the hype from tier one suppliers? What's your view?
But I think it's a mixed picture, if I'm honest. So I think what I see is some authorities who just default to type. So we'll use much of the same as what we've done because it served us really well, and we'll carry on with that. And that's wholly appropriate, and for some authorities who don't have the, we know authorities are really up against it in terms of cash at the moment and budgets. So for some authorities who don't have the resource, they don't have the budgets, that is absolutely fine. I think all I would say is that, actually open up and widen them conversations internally, because actually the ability is there to do a little bit of joining up across a number of different areas. And sometimes you don't know what funding pots people are perhaps holding that they've got, the ability to spend, whether that's, a little bit of innovation funding or actually access to other government grants and other government funding streams. That we see digital programs pop up in the most bizarre places, funding for digital innovation. And I think sometimes, that is quite hard to try and kind of tie into if you don't know what's going on across, other different areas. So I think, absolutely, that kind of engagement with the market side is an important part to help and support that.
And what's your view on, I've seen a couple of examples in the last year of local authorities creating a new procurement mechanism in the digital infrastructure space where it's a co-partnership one. Do you think there's an opportunity here, given the level of innovation and research and development in the digital infrastructure space? Do you think there's an opportunity here to co-develop solutions between the public and private sector, where the investment comes from the private sector to use the public sector as a test bed?
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely, I do. And there's some great examples out there. I'm sure, kind of Liz St. Louis up in Sunderland and Patrick Melia won't mind me name checking them in that respect. They've done some great things. And, what you're then seeing is that is a catalyst to industry and more innovation from the private sector. And they've done some really, really good layered work in terms of building a number of different layers. So it's not all with a single supplier, it's with different suppliers to do different types of things, but it's coordinated and it's joined up, and there's a lot more, kind of common conversations that are happening. And we've more recently done, we've been part of working with Liverpool City Region Combined Authority since 2018, where we've put together and we've now successfully got up and running a joint venture. And that joint venture, it's not an innovation partnership, but it's now starting to see some of those innovations coming out. So we've been very focused on the build program, and the joint venture is a partnership between 3 suppliers, so NG concessionaires who've kind of funded and are doing the build, ITS Technology Group, who are doing all of the operations and maintenance and the sales and the end customer, and then obviously the combined authority itself, who are bringing together and acting very much as a convening role to very much promote that network. Now, the network it's a fiber network, it's a dark fiber network, it's an open access network, it's a backhaul network, it connects up transatlantic cables. But what it does do, it creates the platform to then go on and do those more innovative, aspects. So a joint venture, arguably very labor intensive. That's what I would say. And a lot of authorities would kind of go, oh gosh, we're not doing that. you know, you can have other partnerships. You know, Digital Greenwich is a good example, you know, where they've got suppliers at different levels to come and do slightly different things. You know, and there's a whole host of other, you know, examples across the country. You know, a partnership can be a collaboration agreement. It can be a partnership agreement. You don't have to necessarily procure an innovation partnership. It depends what you want it to bring. Innovation partnerships, I think, have definitely got a role to play. Um, but you know, equally, there's a lot of ways of going about doing that now. And you know, I certainly favour more of a, you know, let's co-design it and not necessarily have a contract that sits against it. Flip sides to that are that if you don't have a contract, then you don't necessarily have the teeth to be able to, you know, look at performance and is it happening and what happens if it doesn't happen. But equally, that can quite often be a disincentive, you know, and I think, you know, you don't have to necessarily have a real rigid, you know, performance framework that says, you know, you will deliver so many customer connections or so much, you know, miles of fiber, or, you know, you'll, you know, kind of, you know, have us completely 5G covered in 5 years' time. You don't have to do that, because you want to evolve, and you want a partnership to actually work with both the locality, the authority, the challenges, the different needs and demands that will inevitably challenge and move over time. So I think there's a whole host of different things, you know, as part of that.
Great advice. And I think just to say to others listening, so we've got a few more minutes left for the webinar. So please, if there are any questions for Chris, please do send them through. I'll sort of start to summarize some of the things that you said, Chris. Is, you know, one is that digital infrastructure is a massive enabler. So it's not just once you've installed it, it doesn't mean that's your job done. There's still much more to be done. It's got to be based on use cases. So really think about use cases now, think about use cases in the future, and think about how digital can act as an enabler. Create ecosystems. So you don't always have to work with the tier one. So the cooperative agreement that you mentioned, you could bring other innovators in to solve, so you create ecosystems to solve problems. Then there's something around horizon scanning, talk to the market, be that intelligent client so you know what you're buying and you define the right procurement routes. And then on procurement routes, be creative. It could be partnerships. We've got, and I'd encourage colleagues from across the UK, whether it's Greenwich, whether it's Sunderland and others, to showcase your case studies. So what types of procurement routes did you apply to bring more innovation in? Because they are, as Chris mentioned, world class. And then the other point, Chris, you made, which is really relevant, is around leadership. Is all of this is only possible if you get the right air cover, the right support, the right incentivization internally to be able to do this different stuff, because everyone's so busy. So I think that's a really, you know, good set of advice and guidance. I'm just checking with my colleagues. Do we have any questions in the chat? And if we do, could we post them, please? In fact, I've just received one. So Chris, in terms of projects that you've been proud of, could you give us 2 or 3 where you've seen value being realized?
Gosh, yeah. I have to be careful kind of which clients I've kind of like prioritize it. I mean, I think, you know, clearly the largest, you know, kind of connection of public sector buildings across Greater Manchester, which has now created the ability through the GM1 network, which was always its enabler. You know, the digital infrastructure was just, you know, literally connecting the buildings, which was a big challenge in its own right. But what we saw off the back of that, you know, we delivered it through the pandemic. So, you know, it kicked off literally and we went into lockdown. You know, I do remember the very first mobilization meeting, and then literally the following day it was like, that's it, everyone don't move, you know, you're all locked down. And it was like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do here? And of course we had funding requirements attached to that. I think all of the spin-offs off the back of that, things like the, you know, the Greater Manchester Tech Fund, the digital inclusion work that the team have done, and you know, I think James has posted some, you know, some really good links to the wider piece that has then gone on to deliver around things like the social housing pilots that GM have done. And of course, it very much feeds right into the middle of the GM digital blueprint, the Greater Manchester digital blueprint. And there's a lot of information available on GMCA's website that colleagues can look at. So I'd certainly, with the work that we're doing up there at the moment, and there's still a lot of legacy stuff going on from the LFFM, but what it's also doing now, it's stimulating the next piece. And obviously, for those people that are eagle-eyed, will have seen the announcement that Greater Manchester obviously got, were successful in the 5GIR bid. That is off the back of, being able to have the local full fibre network, because we can now start really, adding more use cases and test cases to that. Clearly we've been, really, really proud of being involved with the Liverpool City region as well as the neighbouring authority. But of course, LCRCA did it differently. They went down the joint venture route. So it was slightly different, but it was fantastic to draw parallels between the two. And of course, the work, kind of a UK first digital adoption strategy down in Berkshire. But the very early pioneering work we did with the cooperative down in mid Sussex has to be up there as well, because that has really opened up the local supply chain. It did things differently, using a completely different procurement model, using a cooperative that very much is regulated under the Financial Conduct Association, the FCA. Yep. So it's outside of PCR to some degree. So, we didn't even need to procure a contract there, because you're operating in an open free market anyway, and all the authority has to do is become a member. So that was right at the kind of the cutting edge in terms of actually doing contracts slightly different. So it's a difficult one, Rakesh. Have I got a top 2 or 3? No, probably not. I take a lot of pride, and some great people in my organization. It's not just me. There's a lot of fantastic people who've brought these projects to fruition. And of course, most important, those clients that open the door to sort of say, actually, what's the art of the possible? Can we do this? And to have that, you talked about horizon scanning, to have that ambition, to have that drive and commitment. And we've had some really challenging times and some really, really difficult points in these projects. But of course, what that's done, that's really brought out that senior exec sponsorship, having SROs, having, chief execs who want briefings all the time. That's fantastic. That's brilliant, because we know that they're fully engaged with that. And equally having proper governance structures. So we're really, really proud, and, it's a great legacy to have left real good governance in terms of project boards and project teams and steering groups that actually have then gone on to start developing their own projects, when we're not there anymore. So it's a really important piece to get proper governance behind these projects, because that's what brings them to reality.
Thank you, Chris. And in fact, Chris, a few questions have come in now. So if anyone's sending questions through, please do also leave your name and which authority you're from or your organization. So the first one is, someone has said, IT colleagues sometimes wrap themselves around digital infrastructure programs and they don't bring the service owners or the procurement people into the conversation. At a high level or a really quick level, how would you respond to that? Any advice for colleagues?
So I think everything's got to be co-designed. Yep. So I don't think it can start off somewhere and then effectively you bring in all your support services to make it happen. It's got to be co-designed from the beginning. And we're doing exactly that similar sort of project with St Helens at the moment, where actually we've set the project team up right from the beginning, and it's got procurement and it's got legal, and they've all been part of doing the options appraisal around what the model might look like and what our challenges are. So I think for me, co-design at an early stage, but equally don't forget about bringing place people into that. It can't just be led by IT colleagues who know the architecture and know the stuff. It's got to be a wider conversation these days, and if that means you've got to get someone from economic development, someone from the skills team, someone from highways to come into that and operate as a little group, that's what I would advocate.
Great advice. And then another one, thank you, Ben, for this one. How do you get the politicians on side? For the councillors?
Yeah. And do you know what? I think you're pushing at an open door. I think in part, yes, of course, there's a representation of local communities and the usual suspects always crop up in terms of we don't want a mast and we don't want telegraph poles and we don't want infrastructure coming across, that we've not had before. We don't want anyone digging up our roads and our footways. And of course, there's a whole range of competing priorities. I think what we've certainly seen is that authorities that really make progress in the digital infrastructure space and digital inclusion have got a portfolio holder who champions digital, and it might incorporate, they may incorporate skills and economic development as part of their wider portfolio. For me, we've done a lot of member briefings. So I remember very early doors, probably back in 2018, 2019, when we were kicking off the Mid Sussex one. We were regularly up in front of members explaining, why digital's important and what the network was going to bring, and just to make sure that there was real visibility. And then quite a lot of authorities have member officer working groups, and member officer engagement. Use those as forums to be able to go and take an item on digital and talk about, even if it's just kind of a little bit of awareness around what's going on at the moment, and it might not be programs that the authorities progressing. It might just be, here's a little bit of a rattle through technologies, and this is what maybe DCIT or BDUK are doing at the moment.
And Chris, on that, there's obviously been quite a lot of bad press over the last few years on privacy and data.
Yeah.
How would you advise local authorities to navigate that conversation, particularly internally?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, most of our procurements require suppliers to look at things like cyber essentials, as a minimum, a de minimis, really. And of course, data warehousing is a completely separate conversation around, who holds that data, what are the, what are the privacy requirements, what are the protocols that we have internally as organizations, what are we sharing, what are we not sharing, what needs to be open access so that it actually stimulates the, that local ecosystem to develop things and use some of that. Most of the procurements that we've done and most of the contracts we've been involved in and our authority colleagues are involved in, have some real specific requirements around data sharing agreements and kind of what is what's commercially sensitive and what isn't allowed to be provided or should, and then actually what those protocols are to absolutely ensure that we are top of our game in terms of cyber security. And there's a number of initiatives underway at the moment across the UK which authorities can tap into to kind of get central government support around cyber essential cyber security and what big data means. I think you've got to be really cautious, because of course suppliers have got a huge role to play here as well, and that's the biggest thing that you are really looking to check and test if you're going out and putting something out there. Is what is it that they're bringing, what can they offer you, what certainties and kind of protocols are put in place to do that. But there's a lot of resource out there, Rakesh, that people can tap into to kind of get some of the minimum requirements that you would expect. And as I say, you've also got to keep a little bit of flexibility, because you want in certain scenarios to have an open access, open data, type approach.
And Chris, thank you for that. And there's a question here from Jim. So when you're in the innovation space, sometimes developing a business case in advance is difficult, particularly if your horizon's scanning 5, 10, 15 years. How would you advise a local authority when they're building a business case for digital infrastructure to go about it?
Yeah, I mean, some of it comes back to, actually aggregating and building up knowledge and information and awareness across different program and policy areas, because it may not be, actually, it doesn't have to come from a specific area. It can actually suddenly manifest itself across a number of different locations and another number of different policy and program areas. So quite often it's kind of bringing digital out in the conversation where you've already got shared conversations going on. And that might be at a senior leadership team level. It might be, around a particular initiative. It might be around, kind of transformation programs within an authority, around what the art of a digital network could actually bring. And that's from an infrastructure side, not necessarily an integration or a service layer side. So yeah, it's a good question, and it's a difficult one to kind of say, that is it. But for me, it's about kind of looking at joining up across program and policy areas, stacking those use cases. So it might be yours is a really, really simple basic use case, but actually put together with somebody else's and something else suddenly is a very simple solution for the market to respond against. And actually, you're probably going to bring 3 little bits of funding that you would be paying otherwise elsewhere through your own individual contracts to play into that. Plus, then reaching out through some of these pots of funding that we're seeing all the time, starting to creep out from central government, and that's important, because I think we're always looking for test beds and trying to do things slightly differently. And I think for authorities to try and start off small, but start bringing the conversation together across a number of different areas is really, really powerful. You don't have to, we don't have to do the big bang and it sorts everything out in one go and suddenly you've got a smart city or a smart town, or you've completely transformed or enabled your digital infrastructure across your public sector service layer. You don't have to do that. It can be lots of small little interventions. And I think another way of doing that is open up with the market, get the market to come in and give you a thought leadership piece.
Yeah.
We've been very, very successful in running a couple of smart cities workshops now, where we brought a lot of industry in to some of our clients, and that has been massively beneficial, because those ideas coming in from the market, they're the people who are doing it day in, day out, and providing you get the right people, the thought leaders, to come in, it will absolutely broaden your horizons, to actually things that you probably thought, gosh, I didn't even know there was a use case around that. Like,
Chris, look, I mean, I could talk for another hour or two quite easily, and it's been fascinating. And thank you for all your thoughts. And if anyone's got any questions around this, please ask IPEC. Please contact with Chris from CJ Associates, because there's a lot of thought leadership there. And Chris has gone through a series of different scenarios with a wide range of local authorities on making digital infrastructure work, starting from ideas to all the way to scalable solutions, from procurement to culture change to develop a new ecosystem. So Chris, thank you again for your time today. In closing, a few other things. If you're interested in what we've spoken about today, please visit ipec.org.uk. Do join our IPEC LinkedIn community page. And again, we can share more discussions like Chris has shared today. So thank you once again, Chris. It's been really insightful. And thank you to everyone for listening.
Thank you, Rakesh. Thank you, guys, on the webinar.